Welcome to day 128 on the trail. We have three readings for today from John chapter 11, verses 1 through 27, the 107th Psalm, and 1 Maccabees chapter 6, verses 1 through 17. In 1 Maccabees, I want to comment briefly on the death of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. As we discussed earlier, Antiochus IV inflicted terrible physical, economic, cultural, and religious suffering upon the Jewish people. Part of his cruel campaign was to defame God by destroying Torah scrolls and defiling the temple, including erecting a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering in 167 BC. When we explore the book of Daniel later along the trail, we will find that the reign and atrocities of Antiochus IV will play a major role in the latter half of that book. Antiochus died in late 164 BC after attempting to rob a pagan temple in Persia. He then learns that his armies in Judea have been defeated at the hands of Judas, and he is driven into a Great Depression. On his deathbed, Antiochus makes arrangements for his son, Antiochus V Eupator, who was only about 10 or 11 years old, to assume his throne. Antiochus V was essentially a child puppet, whose reign only lasted 3 years, before he was executed by Demetrius I, son of Seleucus IV. Demetrius I was the rightful heir, but had been held hostage in Rome. Despite his arrogance, pride, and cruelty, Antiochus IV dies ignobly in a foreign land. Turning now to the Gospel of John. At the conclusion of John chapter 10, Jesus left Jerusalem after being threatened with stoning and arrest. He crossed the Jordan and returned to the place where John the Baptist had baptized Jesus and first identified Jesus as the Son of God. Here, it seems Jesus' journey has come full circle, because the next time Jesus will arrive in Jerusalem, it will be for the final time. While staying in the wilderness, Jesus received news from a family he cared deeply about who lived in a town called Bethany, approximately 1.5 miles from Jerusalem. From John 11, beginning in verse 1. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, Lord, he whom you love is ill. At this point in the story, we know a couple of things. First, Lazarus, a close friend of Jesus, is sick, very sick. Also, Jesus had a close relationship with this family, since they were aware of his location in the wilderness after he left Jerusalem. Now, due to the seriousness of Lazarus' illness, Mary and Martha send word to Jesus because they believe he can help. And despite the recent threats to Jesus' life, they need him to come right away. Continuing in verse 4. But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. A family in dire need has asked Jesus to come and save the life of their loved one. So why does Jesus delay? Or why does Jesus not heal Lazarus from a distance, as he did when he healed the royal official's son in John chapter 4? Even John, the author, addresses this question when he points out in verse 5 that Jesus really loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Now, we know how this story ends. Lazarus' illness will lead to his death. But we also know that Lazarus will walk out of his tomb. And then in chapter 12, he will eat dinner with his family. However, this also means that Lazarus will have to face death not once, but twice. And his family will have to go through the grieving process twice. And there is a bigger question here. In verse 4, Jesus says, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Does God truly allow his followers to suffer for his glory, or to teach something to others? We faced this same question earlier in John chapter 8, in the healing of the man who was blind from birth. There, Jesus told his disciples in verse 3, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him." When we are faced with this often difficult question, we should first remember that we are reading about the faithfulness of these followers of Jesus 2,000 years later. And their stories have inspired countless lives throughout the generations. We would do well to leave such a legacy of faith and trust in God ourselves. After 2 days have passed, Jesus decides to travel to Bethany. This period of time is not random, but intentional. It is generally accepted that Jesus was about a day's journey from Bethany when he received news that Lazarus was ill. Therefore, if he stays 2 days across the Jordan in the wilderness and spends another day traveling back to Bethany, 4 days will have passed. Now, at this time, there was a Jewish belief that for 3 days, the soul of those who died returns to the grave, believing that it can return to its body. However, when the soul sees the color of its face has changed after the 3rd day, it permanently departs. Therefore, a person's death was truly final on the 4th day. After these 2 days have passed, Jesus informs the disciples that they are returning to Judea, a mere 2 miles from Jerusalem. And they express their concern then for Jesus' safety. Verse 8, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and you are going there again?" However, one of the disciples shows tremendous courage and turns to his fellow disciples and says, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Which disciple demonstrates such boldness and bravery? Thomas. However, what description do we typically add to Thomas's name? We call him Doubting Thomas. But guess how many Thomases there actually are in the Bible? 1. So there's no need to refer to him by any additional title. So why then do we label Thomas the doubter? Because after Jesus' resurrection, he doubted. But I do not believe that he necessarily doubted Jesus. Instead, I think he was doubting the other disciples who were still hiding out in the upper room. After all, we were told later in John's Gospel that Thomas was not there when Jesus appeared to the other disciples. And to be fair, the disciples were not the most trustworthy witnesses at this point. Just 4 short days prior, they had fallen asleep when Jesus needed them and was asking them to pray for him in the Garden of Gethsemane. That same night, they scattered into the darkness when Jesus was arrested. And one of them had even denied even knowing Jesus, not once, but 3 times. And now, they are still hiding behind locked doors. So Thomas has a pretty good reason to doubt what they are saying. But here, in John 11, we see the courage and fortitude of Thomas. In this moment, Thomas is willing to face death with Jesus. So when Jesus arrives in Bethany, Mary went out to meet Jesus. Now it was customary for those who were mourning to never leave the house for 7 days, except to go to the tomb. Yet Martha went out to meet Jesus. And upon seeing him, she says to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." First, remember this statement by Martha: "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Martha demonstrates her faith in the power of Jesus and his ability to bring healing in the most dire of situations. And we will also see this exact same statement from Martha's sister Mary when we look at the second half of this story. But the response of Jesus to Mary will be dramatically different. Same statement, two divergent responses from Jesus. Second, in Jesus' response to Martha, we find another "I am" statement from Jesus, and one of the most powerful expressions of Jesus' mission. Beginning in verse 25, Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." Despite Martha's question of Jesus' late arrival and her grief over the death of her brother, Martha not only trusts Jesus, but she also offers one of the greatest confessions of faith in the New Testament. Jesus is not just a healer, teacher, or friend. He is the Messiah, the Son of God, and the one who has the power to grant eternal life in the face of death. Now, due to the power and importance of this story in the Gospel of John, we have divided this story over 2 days on the trail. This moment in Bethany forms a pivotal moment as Jesus begins his final return to Jerusalem and the completion of his mission on a hill outside of that great city. When we return to John 11, we will hear from Martha's sister Mary when she meets Jesus. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.